You grow up in Nemesio's shadow, and you don't realize it's a shadow until you're old enough to understand what the light is. In Culotitlan, you are just brothers, two boys in a poor family in Aguililla, Michoacán, in the specific poverty of the Tierra Caliente that is so complete and so ordinary that poverty is not the word you use for it, because poverty implies a deviation from a standard, and there is no standard available to deviate from. There is the land and the avocado trees and the school you both attend, until the school stops being worth attending because the fields pay more than the classroom promises, and the promise is too distant, and the payment is immediate, and the family needs what is immediate. El Mencho dropped out of primary school in 5th grade to work in the fields. At the age of 14, he started guarding marijuana plantations. Al Jazeera. Nemesio leaves the fields before you do. He leaves everything before you do. He is the kind of man who is always moving toward the next thing, while you are still finishing the current thing, and the distance between you has that character from the beginning. He is further ahead, and you are following, and the following is not resentment. It is just the shape of the relationship. He is the older brother. He moves first. You watch where he goes and you calibrate. He goes north first, to California, to the heroin trade in the Central Valley that connects the Mexican supply chains to the American demand. You are still in Aguililla when he is in Fresno. You hear about his life through the family network, through your mother who receives calls and relays them with the careful incompleteness of a woman who understands that what she knows is safer than what she says. He is doing well. He is finding his way. The specifics of the way are not discussed. In 1994, a U.S. district court sentenced him to 3 years in prison for conspiracy to distribute heroin. After his release, he returned to Mexico, where he served as a police officer in Cabo Corrientes and Tomatlan in Jalisco. Al Jazeera. He comes back to Mexico with a California prison term behind him and a knowledge of how the American side of the supply chain works that very few men in the Tierra Caliente possess. He becomes a police officer, which you understand even then is not a career change. It is a strategic position. The uniform is the tool that provides intelligence and access, and the specific immunity of a man who is simultaneously the law and working against it. He wears it for the purpose and leaves it when the purpose is served. You follow him to Jalisco, not immediately, not dramatically, over years, through the gradual pull of a brother who is building something, and who needs people he trusts completely, and who trusts completely only the people he has known since the avocado fields and the school and the specific shared poverty of Culotitlan. Trust in the organization Nemesio is building is an asset he cannot buy anywhere. It can only be grown in people who were present before the building began. You are one of those people. Under his sibling, Oseguera Cervantes was responsible for supervising the buying and selling of firearms for the CJNG. He was also responsible for managing money laundering schemes and passing on information of law enforcement activities to the CJNG, Center for Strategic and International Studies. Your role is logistics, not the public face, not the operational command. You are the man who makes sure the things that need to exist, exist. The weapons that the organization requires, sourced, purchased, moved through the supply chains that run from the American arms markets through the border and into the CJNG's arsenal. The financial flows that the organization generates move through the mechanisms that convert cartel revenue into assets that can be owned and used without explaining their origin. And the intelligence, the monitoring of law enforcement activity, the relationships with officials who provide early warning, the specific function of a man who keeps the organization's eyes open at the institutional level. This is less visible than the violence and more foundational than the violence. An organization cannot sustain violence without weapons. It cannot sustain weapons without money. It cannot sustain money without the financial architecture that processes it. You are not the soldier. You are the supply chain that makes the soldier possible. The distinction matters to you professionally and will not matter to the American prosecutors and will matter enormously to your lawyers. Nemesio rises. The CJNG rises with him. You watch this from the inside with the specific perspective of a man who was present at the beginning, who remembers when the organization was a faction of the Milenio Cartel rather than the dominant criminal force in Western Mexico, when El Mencho was a name known in the underworld rather than a name on a $15 million American bounty poster, when the two brothers from Aguililla were figuring out how the Jalisco criminal landscape worked rather than determining what it looked like. You are proud of him. This is the thing that is hardest to explain to anyone outside the relationship and the geography. You are his brother. You watched him build something from nothing in the specific way that men from the Tierra Caliente build things, through will and violence and an organizational intelligence that formal education never provided and that turns out not to require formal education. The pride is complicated by everything the building cost and everything it produces, and the distance between the two brothers from Culotetlan and the organization their lives have become. But the pride is real. The first arrest comes in December 2015. On the 3rd of December 2015, Oseguera Cervantes was driving in Tlajomulco, Jalisco, when he noticed the presence of the federal police and the Mexican army. As he tried to avoid passing through them at a checkpoint near his home, the officers ordered him to stop. He was driving a 2010 Volkswagen Jetta, was not accompanied by a bodyguard, and claimed to be a clothing merchant. Center for Strategic and International Studies. This is the detail that stays with you from the arrest, not because it matters legally, but because it captures something about how you were living. Not in an armored vehicle, not in a convoy. In a Jetta, alone, trying to avoid a checkpoint the way anyone would avoid a checkpoint, with a story about clothing that you used because it was available and not because it was convincing. You were living low. You were doing what the organization's survival protocols required. You were not living in a way that matched what the prosecutors would put in their documents, the language about high-ranking leader and major blow to the financial circle. He was imprisoned at the Federal Social Readaptation Center, number 11, a maximum security prison in Sonora. Center for Strategic and International Studies. You are in maximum security in Sonora, while Nemesio is in the mountains. This is the first time the shadow becomes visible from inside it. You are in a cell and he is free, and the same choices that put you both here produce different outcomes for each of you. And the difference is not entirely about what you each did, and is partly about what the arrest lottery produces when two brothers make the same general category of choices, and one gets caught first. A judge later released him from prison after determining that there were violations in his due process. Center for Strategic and International Studies. You are released on a procedural defect. The relief is real, and the relief is also a specific kind of borrowed time that you understand clearly, because you have been inside the legal system long enough to understand what procedural release means in the context of a federal investigation that hasn't stopped running. Because you got out. The investigation is still running. The Americans have sanctioned you. The American Treasury put your name on a list in 2016 that freezes your U.S. assets and prohibits U.S. persons from transacting with you. And that is the beginning of the documentary record that will eventually follow you across the border. You go back to work, not because you have no other choice. This is the narrative the prosecution will tell, and it is not entirely wrong and not entirely right. You go back because the organization is the structure your life runs through, and leaving the structure requires a destination, and the destination requires a new life, and the new life requires a different person than the person you are, and at 57 years old in Jalisco with a sanctions designation and a federal file, and a brother who runs the most powerful criminal organization in Mexico, the geography of available destinations is genuinely constrained. You go back because you are Tony Montana, and Nemesio is El Mencho, and the names are also a commitment. The nickname, someone gave you the name Tony Montana and it stuck with the specific adhesive quality of nicknames that capture something true. The movie was enormous in the Tierra Caliente when you were young, the story of a man from poverty who built an empire through violence and intelligence, and the specific immigrant's refusal to accept the limitations the world presented him. You understood even then that the story was a tragedy disguised as a triumph, and that the disguise was the point. The tragedy was in the ending, and the triumph was in the building, and the Tierra Caliente watched the triumph and understood the ending as a risk rather than a destination. You are Tony Montana in a 2010 Volkswagen Jetta, avoiding a checkpoint. The gap between the name and the reality is the gap between the mythology and the life, and the mythology is what the organization runs on, and the life is what you actually live. The second arrest comes in December 22. On the 20th of December 22, Oseguera Cervantes was captured while in possession of weapons in a suburb of Guadalajara. Authorities said he oversaw violent actions and logistics and bought weapons and laundered money for the cartel. Center for Strategic and International Studies. This time there is no procedural defect available. The file is too complete. The Americans have been building it since 2016, and it has 7 years of documentation in it now. And the documentation is the kind that survives the motions your lawyers file. Because the lawyers file every motion available, and some of them produce delays and none of them produce dismissal because the case is the case and the case is what it is. You go to the Federal Social Readaptation Center again, maximum security again. But this time the investigation is running on a different track. The extra